the discovery that was never supposed to exist. In the early 21st century, a group of independent analysts working with satellite data noticed a piece of land that should have meant nothing. Central Europe, an abandoned railway junction, decommissioned in the late 1940s. No buildings, no roads, only forest, grass, and faint railway lines disappearing underground, without explanation. But it was here that the satellites detected something wrong. Infrared scans revealed elongated geometric shapes beneath the surface. They did not change. They did not react to temperature. They remained perfectly defined for decades. Too precise to be natural. Too familiar to be accidental. Approximately 90 meters long, proportions matching a train convoy, aligned with railway tracks closed for more than 70 years. According to official records, no underground structures of that scale had ever existed there. Yet the thermal data suggested otherwise. Something segmented, divided, separated into compartments, the way train cars are. One train was never captured, never destroyed. It simply vanished. No crash, no witnesses, no debris. And now, decades later, beneath the ground, a shape appeared that was never supposed to be there. Part 2. The final route, when the Reich began to retreat. By the spring of 1945, the Third Reich was no longer fighting for victory. It was fighting to preserve whatever could still be saved. The fronts were closing in. Allied forces advanced from the west. The Red Army pressed from the east. Cities fell one after another. Industrial centers turned into high-risk zones. Factories faced imminent capture. Archives faced something worse, falling into enemy hands. For the Reich, this was more dangerous than the loss of territory, because the war was no longer just about land. It was about knowledge, about technology, about information. It was at this moment that German command activated one of the least studied mechanisms of the war: evacuation logistics operations. These were not simple retreats. They were carefully planned relocations. Factories were dismantled in a matter of days. Equipment was labeled, taken apart, and packed. Documents were sealed in airtight containers. Blueprints, reports, protocols. Everything that could not be allowed to fall into enemy hands. Valuable cargo was not transported by road. Too slow, too visible. The primary reliance was on the rail network. Faster, quieter, more reliable. But not all trains were the same. There existed a special category of convoys. They did not appear in standard transport registers. They carried no conventional identification numbers. They were absent from civilian timetables. These trains reported directly to military command, and often to no one else. It was precisely such convoys that departed from Silesia, from Bohemia, from the central regions of Germany in the final weeks of the war. They moved at night. They altered their routes. Sometimes they stopped where no stations existed, and sometimes they never reached their destination. In April of 1945, one such train left an industrial region already under threat of capture. According to surviving indirect data, the convoy consisted of several armored rail cars. It was accompanied by reinforced security units. Its route was classified even from railway authorities. No description of its cargo has survived. Transport logs record only the departure, the date, the time, the point of origin. Records of arrival are absent. At the time, this caused no alarm. In the chaos of the war's final weeks, thousands of trains were lost, abandoned, or destroyed by their own crews to avoid capture. But years later, historians noticed a strange detail. This train does not appear in any Allied report. It was not captured, not destroyed, not found abandoned on the tracks, as if it vanished between 2 points. Some researchers suggest the convoy was deliberately diverted from its original route and sent into a region of no military significance to the advancing armies, an area with a dense rail network, natural cover, hills, mines, and pre-existing underground infrastructure. The same area where, decades later, satellites would record a strange anomaly. It is important to understand, in 1945, the railway was more than transportation. It was the Reich's final artery. Trains carried more than cargo. They carried the future. Documents, technology, information. And if even one of these convoys was never found, if it appears neither among trophies nor losses, then it means only one thing. Someone made sure in advance that it would disappear forever. And perhaps its final route has not yet ended.
Part 3. The train without a name. Every train has a number, a route, a point of departure, a destination. Even in the final days of the war, the railway system relied on records, on paper, in logs, in orders. But this convoy did not fit the system. It had no official identification number. It did not appear in standard classifications. It was absent from the Reich's final reports. Pause formally. It did not exist. Pause. It was never described directly, never documented as a single entity. Instead, it appeared in fragments, in traces, in indirect references. A separate note authorizing armored rail cars. An order assigning reinforced security without stating a purpose. A request for night clearance on a restricted section of track. Pause. Each document by itself seemed ordinary. Together, they formed something else. A train without a name. A convoy that exists on paper, but never as a whole. No single document names it outright. No report captures it in full, only shadows. Later, historians noticed another disturbing detail. Standard evacuation trains used regular railcars, minimal guards, direct routes. This one was different. Armored sections, armed escorts, excessive security measures, as if they were not protecting the cargo, but the very fact that it existed. This train cannot be followed from beginning to end. It cannot be fixed in one place at one time. It appears in documents and immediately disappears, like a ghost reflected in glass, leaving no footprints behind. And that is precisely why it matters. Because in a system where everything is meant to be recorded, the most suspicious thing is what officially does not exist. A train without a number, without a name, without a final report, but with real routes, real guards, and a very real disappearance. It existed, precisely because someone tried to erase it.
The final signal. The train did not vanish instantly. It left a trace, the last one, and the only one. The radio transmission was recorded late at night, a brief communication window. No unnecessary words, no clarifications. A standard movement report, route confirmation, a routine log entry. Nothing unusual. The duty officer received the message, marked the time, signed the record. After that, silence. The connection did not cut off abruptly. There was no distress call, no emergency code. The transmission simply ended. The next control point expected the train several hours later. It was supposed to arrive, but it never did. At first, the delay was considered normal. Damaged tracks, overloaded junctions, the chaos of the final days of the war. But hours passed, then an entire day, and it became clear the train was gone. It was not seen at stations. It did not pass through sorting yards. It was not recorded by signal posts. It was not captured, not destroyed, not found abandoned on a dead-end line. Allied records? Silent. Enemy reports? The same. As if after the final signal, it ceased to exist.
Later, historians would notice something disturbing. The route was designed in such a way that disappearing without a trace was virtually impossible. Too many junctions, too many observers, too dense a network, and yet the last entry remains the last. One signal, one log entry, and complete silence. No corrections in the documents, no attempts at explanation, as if someone already knew there would be nothing more to record. This became the first real mystery, because in a war where every rail car and every ton of cargo was counted, the disappearance of an entire train without traces, without witnesses, without consequences, was impossible. It was supposed to appear, but it did not. And from that moment on, the story stopped being just a chronicle of war. It became a question that still has no answer. Part 5. The disappearance zone. Every mystery needs a place, a point on the map, a space where events stop being abstract. In this case, such a place exists. It is not a single object, not one station, not one tunnel. It is an entire region, a mountain range, dense forests, deep valleys, a landscape where the railway does not run straight. It cuts into rock, disappears into tunnels, re-emerges, only to vanish again. Even before the war, this area had developed infrastructure, mining, industrial, military, pores old shafts, technical galleries, underground storage facilities. Pores. Many of them were expanded and reinforced during the war years. Unofficially, very little documentation remains. It was through this region that non-standard routes passed in the final months of the war. Lines rarely used, tunnels absent from civilian maps, sections controlled exclusively by the military. After the war, access to the area became restricted. Not all at once, gradually. Some zones were closed due to demining operations, others because of collapses and accidents, some without any explanation at all. Maps were revised, labels disappeared. Certain tunnels officially never existed. Yet here, all elements converge. Military installations, railway infrastructure, and a strange post-war silence, too consistent to be accidental. If the train vanished, it needed a place where vanishing was possible, a place to hide it, to stop it, or to dismantle it, a zone where it could dissolve into the landscape and into the records at the same time. Part 6. From this moment
Witnesses
on,
who spoke
too late
for a long time.
There were no people in this story,
borders,
only
and
documents,
a name,
routes, the
reports,
disappearance zone, and the gaps between them. But years later, voices began to emerge. They were not heard in interrogations, not recorded in Stab reports. They were heard later, much later. Local residents recalled strange nights, a dull metallic rumble in the mountains, a sound unlike ordinary trains. It appeared after midnight, lasted briefly, then vanished, leaving behind an unnatural silence. Some spoke of convoys, not on roads, on forest paths, deep in the woods, armed men, no insignia. They did not speak to locals and never explained what they were guarding. Railway workers remembered something else. Closed sections of track, orders issued without explanation, tunnels suddenly taken out of service, sometimes literally overnight. One engineer later claimed he saw a tunnel entrance sealed and buried, even though official documents still listed it as operational. Allied soldiers encountered traces only after the war had ended. While on patrol, they found mine entrances, rails disappearing underground, signs of recent activity. Pause. But whenever they tried to investigate further, the response was always the same. Restricted area. No significance. No records available. All these testimonies came too late, after archives had been cleared, routes altered, and decisions finalized. None of them saw the train as a whole, knew what it carried, or where it was headed. But all of them spoke about the same thing: movement that took place outside the official war. Something that was meant to be concluded quietly, without witnesses, without traces. And that is why their words are unsettling. Because these are not rumors. They are memories. Fragments of truth that surfaced only when there was nothing left to change. Part 7. What could have been inside. No document states directly what the train was carrying. There is no inventory, no transfer records, no cargo lists. What remains are possibilities. The first and most obvious: valuables, gold, works of art, objects seized and hidden during the final years of the war, paintings, sculptures, rare collections, items easy to transport but impossible to explain after defeat. The second possibility: Reich archives, documents never meant to fall into Allied hands, correspondence, internal reports, confidential orders, traces of decisions that were never intended to become public. The third possibility: technical developments. Not mythical weapons, but real projects, experimental systems, new materials, engineering solutions ahead of their time, concepts not yet deployed, but potentially valuable to the victors, or to those who plan to survive after the war. There is also a fourth theory: finances, records of transfers, accounts, links to foreign institutions, names, money routes, mechanisms that could continue to function even after the Reich collapsed. What matters most is not which version is correct. It is the fact that the cargo was considered important enough to justify armored rail cars, reinforced security, and a route designed to leave no trace. This does not resemble a chaotic evacuation. It resembles a final attempt to preserve something, not for the war, but for what would come after. And as long as the train remains unfound, each of these possibilities remains open, because gaps in the records inevitably invite questions, and sometimes answers that are simply not yet ready to be discovered. Part 8. The modern investigation. Decades have passed, generations have changed, witnesses are gone, but the mystery remains. In the 21st century, it returned, not as rumors, not as legends, but as data. Modern investigations began quietly: ground-penetrating radar, thermal imaging, laser terrain scanning, technologies designed to see what lies beneath the surface. And they detected something unusual. In a region long considered geologically well studied, anomalies appeared: voids, extended cavities, structures with straight edges, not consistent with natural formations. Independent teams reached similar results: different methods, different equipment, the same conclusions. There is something artificial beneath the ground. Part 9. Why it was never found. At first glance, the answer seems simple. Post-war chaos, a shattered Europe, millions displaced, thousands of lost documents. Under such conditions, the disappearance of a single train might appear insignificant, but the deeper the records are examined, the weaker that explanation becomes. Because after the war, everything was searched for. Weapons, archives, gold, people, every convoy, every warehouse, every tunnel was scrutinized, except this one. The second reason: political interests. A new era was beginning, new alliances, a new confrontation. Information became currency, and not everything that was discovered was meant to be revealed. Some documents were better left unfound. The third reason: deliberate concealment, restricted zones, revised maps, missing reports. This does not resemble coincidence. It resembles effort, an effort to ensure the question would never be asked. And finally, the most uncomfortable reason: a lack of desire to reopen the past. Because the past sometimes asks questions that have no safe answers. It is easier to leave a blank space in the archives than to explain why it exists. And that leads to a different question. What if the train was never found, not because it could not be, but because it was never meant to be searched for? Because sometimes a mystery does not live underground. It lives in the decision not to dig. Part 10. The train had already served its purpose. We are used to asking the wrong question. We ask, where is the train? But perhaps the question should be different. Why was it needed? When the entire sequence of events is examined, one thing becomes clear. The train was never meant to be preserved forever. It was not prepared for recovery. It served another purpose: to buy time. Time to evacuate people, to relocate documents, to redirect money and information. While armies were advancing, other processes were already moving into the shadows. In that sense, the train was not the objective. It was a tool, a distraction, a mobile point of uncertainty. Something meant to be searched for, while the real decisions were being made elsewhere. Once its disappearance became a fact, the mission was complete. There was no need to explain the route, no need to reveal the cargo, no need to close the records, because the conclusion had already been reached. Perhaps that is why it was never seriously searched for, because finding it would have meant returning to the moment when those decisions could still have been stopped. And that was not in anyone's interest, which leads to the most unsettling thought. Perhaps the train was never lost. Perhaps it arrived, just not where we were taught to look. Not in the mountains, not in the tunnels, not even underground, but in a future that began taking shape at that exact moment. And if that is true, then the train is still moving, just in a different form.